When the war formally expanded on the Western Front in December 1971, Sakhagarh didn't immediately erupt into the inferno of tank duels that history would later remember. The opening phase was quieter, slower, and far more deliberate. This was not hesitation, it was calculation. Both India's 11 Corps and Pakistan 1 Corps understood that the first moves in Sakhagarh would decide not just who advanced, but who bled. The opening days were therefore a context of preparation, patience, and nerve, fought less with guns than with shovels, wires, maps, and hours of sleepless tension. India initiated its Western operation with clear hierarchy of priorities. The Eastern theatre demanded speed and decisiveness, while the West demanded control. Indian political and military leadership were acutely aware that Pakistani strategic instinct was to seek dramatic results in Punjab that could offset disasters in the East. As a result, India's 11 Corps was instructed to advance not recklessly. The aim was to neutralize the Sakhagarh bulge methodically, denying Pakistan the freedom to maneuver while preserving Indian forces for sustained operations. On December 4th, Indian units began probing actions across the forward Pakistani defensive belts. These were not massed assaults. Infantry patrol tested minefields, artillery registered targets, and engineers moved forward under cover of darkness to identify obstacles. Pakistani defenders, for their part, didn't reveal their full strength. They relied on pre laid minefields, sporadic artillery fire, and limited infantry engagements to delay and observe. Both sides were feeling for the other's intent, searching for patterns in movement and hesitation. Minefields quickly emerged as the defining feature of the opening phase. Pakistan had invested heavily in layered mine belts across likely Indian axis of advance. They were not crude barriers, they were carefully integrated with natural features such as nalas and soft ground, designed to funnel Indian units into predictable lanes. The intent was to force Indian armour to bunch up and expose itself to fire from prepared Pakistani tank positions. In theory, this was sound defensive engineering. In practice, it depended on the assumption that the attacker would rush. India didn't rush. Indian engineers, protected by infantry and artillery, began the slow and dangerous process of mine clearance. This work was conducted largely at night under constant threat of shelling and small arms fire. Casualties were accepted as a price of progress. Every cleared lane was marked and widened and prepared to carry the weight of tanks. The painstaking approach frustrated Pakistani expectations. Instead of dramatic advances that could be countered decisively, Pakistan saw incremental Indian gains that were hard to reverse without committing armor prematurely. Artillery duels intensified during this phase, Indian guns methodically suppressing suspected Pakistani positions, targeting known defensive positions. Pakistani artillery responded, attempting to disrupt Indian engineering efforts and infantry concentrations. These exchanges were not yet decisive, but they set the psychological tone of the battle. Indian artillery demonstrated accuracy and persistence, while Pakistani fire, though heavy, often lacked the coordination needed to halt progress entirely. The ground began to churn, not from tank tracks, but from shell impacts. On December 5th, Indian infantry had secured several forward positions, creating shallow but firm footholds with the Sakhagarh bulge. These positions were not spectacular, they were essential. They allowed engineers to operate closer to objectives and reduce the distance tanks needed to move once committed. Pakistani commanders observed these developments with growing concern. The Indian advance didn't look like feint, it looked like a deliberate attempt to establish conditions for something larger. Pakistani doctrine dictated that such advances should be countered aggressively before they could consolidate. Yet the timing of counterattack was critical. Commit armor too early and it would begin fighting without clear targets or sufficient information. Commit it too late and Indian bridgeheads could become too strong to dislodge. During these days, Pakistani commanded command faced a dilemma. Intelligence reports were too strong to dislodge. Pardon. Intelligence reports were fragmentary. Visibility was poor. Indian movements were deliberately ambiguous. Pakistani tanks remained largely in reserve, engines idling, crews waiting for orders that didn't come. Indian commanders exploited this hesitation. Rather than pressing everywhere, they focused on selecting axes, particularly those leading to Basantar River. The choice of Basantar wasn't accidental. Indian planners understood that crossing the river would force Pakistanis to respond decisively. A bridgehead there would threaten the integrity of the entire bulge. Every action between December 4th and 6th was therefore aimed at creating the preconditions for that crossing. The psychological strain on troops during this phase was immense. Infantry advanced into mine terrain, knowing that a single misstep could be fatal. Engineers worked under fire with no guarantee that their efforts would not be undone by sudden counterattacks. Tanks crew waited behind enemy lines, listening to artillery and radio traffic, knowing that once committed they would not easily disengage. War in its face was less about heroics, more about endurance. Pakistani forces, for their part, began to feel the pressure of uncertainty. Defensive positions that seemed secure were now under constant observation and fire. The lack of decisive engagement bred frustration among armored commanders eager to prove their doctrine. Yet higher command, aware of the risks, restrained them. This restraint, while understandable, allowed India to continue shaping the battlefield. By the end of December 7, the character of the battle had been set. India had not crossed the Basantar yet. It had moved close enough to make the crossing inevitable. Minefields had been breached, forward positions secured, and artillery lines established. Pakistan had not yet unleashed its armour, but the window for a clean, decisive counterstroke was narrowing rapidly. The bulge was tightening, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through steady pressure. These operations these opening moves reveal the fundamental difference between the two sides. India treated time as an ally, willing to trade speed for certainty. Pakistan treated time as a threat, knowing that prolonged engagement favored Indian resources and depth. The clash between these perceptions would soon erupt into open, armoured battle. Part 5. The Basantar River, the crucible of armour. If Sakhagarh was the arena, the Basantar River was the anvil upon which the battle was forged. Everything before it had been preparation, everything after it would be consequence. The Basantar was not an imposing river by continental standards. It didn't roar or sprawl, yet in December 1971, it became one of the most lethal pieces of ground in South Asian military history because it sat precisely at the intersection of the terrain, doctrine, and will. To cross it was to commit. To cross it, to cross it was to commit irrevocably. To fail to destroy the crossing was to concede the battle. By mid-December, Indian 11 Corps had brought the situation to a point where hesitation was no longer viable. Minefields had been breached, artillery had softened Pakistani forward positions, and infantry units had edged close enough to the Basantar to observe its banks under fire. The river marked the last natural defensive line within the Sakhagarh bulge. Pakistani planners understood this perfectly. Their entire defensive concept now hinged on one assumption: any Indian crossing could and must be crushed by armoured counterattack before it solidified. The Indian decision was to force a crossing was therefore not a tactical impulse but a strategic gamble, carefully calculated. Indian commanders knew that once tank and infantry crossed the Basantar, they would be exposed. Retreat under fire would be difficult, possibly impossible. But they also knew if a bridgehead could be held, if it could survive the inevitable Pakistani counterblows, the bulge would collapse inward. The Basantar was the hinge upon which the entire western front would swing. The crossing began under conditions that favored neither side. Fog reduced visibility, the ground was soft and churned by shell fire. Pakistani artillery probed constantly, searching for cross points. Indian engineers worked under cover of darkness, constructing temporary bridges and preparing for fording operations. Infantry units were pushed forward first, not as sacrificial screens but as anchors. Their task was to seize and hold small patches of ground on the far bank, regardless of cost, until armor could be brought across. When the Indian units crossed, they did so knowing they were stepping into killing zone envisioned by Pakistani planners. Pakistani observers detected movement almost immediately. Artillery fire intensified, machine guns wrecked um, likely crossing areas, yet the crossing didn't collapse. The Indian infantry dug in, using every scrap of cover, every fold in the ground. Engineers followed, expanding lanes, stabilizing approaches, and preparing for tanks. The arrival of Indian armour on the far bank transformed the engagement from a gamble into a test of doctrine. Vijayanta tanks and the T-55s emerged cautiously, not racing forward but positioning themselves defensively, hull down where possible. Trains gun trained on likely avenues of Pakistani approach. This was a critical choice. Indian armour did not seek immediate exploitation, it sought survival. The bridgehead was designed as a trap, not a spear. Pakistani command reached as doctrine demanded. Armoured counterattacks were ordered to destroy the bridgehead before it could be reinforced. Units from 6th Armoured Division and associated formations were committed with urgency. Patton tanks advanced through the Basantar under cover of artillery and smoke, confident that their superior firepower would overwhelm the Indian armour now exposed on the far bank. What followed was not the sweeping maneuver Pakistani doctrine envisioned, but a brutal series of close-range engagements fought under appalling conditions. Fog collapsed engagement distances, smoke from artillery and burning vehicles thickened the air. Tanks sighted each other at 100 meters, sometimes less. In this environment, the theatrical advantage of the Patton evaporated. Gunnery became instinctive. Crew coordination mattered more than specifications. A second of hesitation could mean death. Indian defensive positions proved decisive. Tanks were seated to cover narrow approaches, forcing Pakistani armour to advance through constrained lanes where numerical superiority couldn't be brought to bear effectively. Indian infantry armed with recoilless rifles and anti-tank weapons protected the flanks of the tanks, denying Pakistani crews the freedom to maneuver. Indian artillery fire was relentless, breaking up formations and isolating advancing elements. The bridgehead held not because it was impregnable, but because it was integrated. Pakistani tanks advanced with courage but often without sufficient infantry support. In the chaos of fog and fire, coordination broke down. Units were meant to attack simultaneously arrived piecemeal. Some Pattons surged forward into kill zones already covered by Indian guns. Others hesitated, unsure of the ground ahead. The river, once a defensive asset, now constrained Pakistani movement, compressing tanks into predictable paths. Losses mounted, tanks burnt, crews bailed out under fire or died inside their machines. The Basantar became littered with wreckage, steel carcasses, marking where doctrine had collided with reality. Yet the fighting didn't end with a single repulsed attack. Pakistani command, unwilling to concede the crossing, ordered repeated counterattacks for several days. Each was met with the same grim efficiency. Indian units adapted rapidly, shifting positions, reinforcing weak points, and learning the rhythm of Pakistani assaults. It was during this phase that individual acts of extraordinary courage took on disproportionate significance. Tank commanders fought on despite damage, holding positions that anchored the entire defensive layout. Infantrymen remained at their posts under tank fire, knowing that a single withdrawal could unravel the bridgehead. Engineers continued to maintain crossings under shelling, ensuring that reinforcements and ammunition could follow. The Basantar didn't fall or hold because of a single decision. It was so because hundreds of small decisions made under fire aligned in one direction. By the time Pakistani armoured thrust began to lose momentum, the outcome was becoming clear. The bridgehead had survived the most dangerous phase. Indian reinforcements flowed across the river. Artillery dominance increased. Pakistan units battered and depleted struggled to regroup for further assaults. The initiative, once fiercely contested, began to slip decisively towards India. The Basantar River had fulfilled its role as crucible. It had stripped both sides of illusion. It revealed that armoured warfare in the subcontinent could no longer be decided by shock alone. It required integration, patience, and an acceptance of attrition. For Pakistan, the failure to destroy the bridgehead marked the beginning of the end of its hope in Sakhagarh. For India, holding the Basantar validated years of doctrinal evolution. With the bridgehead secure and Pakistan counterattacks faltering, the battle entered a new phase. The question was no longer whether India could hold, but whether Pakistan could continue to resist. Part 6: Heroes, Units, and the Anatomy of Tactical Brilliance. Once the Basantar bridge had survived its violent tests, the Battle of Sakhagarh entered its most intense and human phase. What followed was no longer a matter of abstract doctrine or operation geometry. It was a contest of crews, regiments, and leaders operating at the edge of exhaustion and fear. In this phase, the battle was decided not by maps, but by minutes, not by course headquarters, but by what happened inside steel turbines filled with smoke, noise, and the smell of cordite. Sakhagarh's decisive quality lay not merely in how formations fought, but in how individuals and units embodied their training under extreme pressure. Indian armored regiments that fought around the Basantar displayed a level of cohesion that was the product of institutional learning since 1965. Units such as the Pune Horse, 17 Horse, Hudson's Horse were not improvising under fire, they were executing doctrines that had been rehearsed, refined, and internalized. Their tank commanders understood that survival didn't lie in reckless advance but in controlled aggression. They fought defensively when necessary, offensively when opportunity presented itself, and always with an awareness of infantry and artillery support. This was not armor used as a part of system, but not as an independent weapon. The Vijayanta tank, often underestimated by external observers, proved its worth in the phase of the battle. Its reliability, easy to maintenance, and adequate firepower allowed Indian crews to operate continuously under harsh conditions. Gunnery training paid dividends. Indian crews were consistently demonstrated faster target acquisition and firing circles at close range where fog and smoke reduced visibility. In engagement where tanks sighted each other suddenly at a few hundred meters, it was often the first accurate shot that decided the outcome. Indian crews drilled relentlessly in such scenarios and exploited this reality. Pakistani Patton crews fought with undeniable bravery. Many advanced into lethal fire knowing the risks. However, bravery alone could not compensate for doctrinal rigidity and breakdowns in coordination. Pakistani armor thrusts were often launched with insufficient reconnaissance, relying on assumptions about Indian dispositions that no longer held true. When Pakistani and Pattons advanced into Indian defensive layouts, they encountered not isolated tanks, but interlocking fields of fire supported by infantry and artillery. The Pattons' superior specifications couldn't compensate for its exposure in such environments. One of the defining features of this phase was the collapse of engagement ranges. Sakhagarh didn't allow for long-range duels. Tanks often fought at distances where every shot mattered, where every error was fatal. In such conditions, command presence became decisive. Indian troop leaders frequently fought from forward positions, maintaining control and morale even as losses mounted. The clarity of Indian command intent, hold, absorb, and destroy gave subordinate leaders a framework within which to act decisively without constant direction. In this context, that acts of individual heroism acquired strategic significance. Among the most iconic stand was the stand made by 2nd Lieutenant Arun Khetrapal of Pune Horse. His actions were not a spontaneous burst of courage divorced from tactical reality. They were the embodiment of the battle's logic. Khetrapal's tank engaged Pakistani armor at close range, destroying multiple tanks despite sustaining damage. When ordered to withdraw after being hit, he refused, understanding that his position was critical to the integrity of the defensive layout. His decision wasn't reckless defiance, but calculated resolve. By holding his ground, he denied Pakistani armor a breakthrough that could unravel the bridgehead. His death didn't weaken the Indian position, but reinforced it, anchoring a line that others could rally around. Such movements were not isolated. Across the bridgehead, Indian tank crews fought on despite damaged tracks, jammed turrets, and wounded comrades. Infantrymen remained at their posts under tank fire, engaging enemy armor with recoilless rifle at terribly close distances. Artillery observers stayed forward, calling in fire even as shells landed nearby. These actions were not driven by romantic notions of sacrifice, they were driven by a clear understanding with withdrawal at the wrong moment could doom the entire operation. Pakistani units, by contrast, began to differ from cumulative attrition and psychological strain. Repeated counterattacks that failed to dislodge Indian positions eroded confidence. Each burnt out Patton was not just a material loss but a symbolic one, undermining the belief that the armour alone could restore the situation. Communications failures compounded the problem. Units attacked without full awareness of neighbouring movements, leading to fragmented assaults that were defeated in detail. Despite this, Pakistani soldiers and officers continued to fight with determination. The failure at Sakhagarh was not one of courage but of systematic adaptation. Pakistani doctrine demanded decisive counter blows that even when conditions favored defense or delay. As losses mounted, this doctrine became a trap. Instead of recalibrating, Pakistani command persisted, committing armour into an environment increasingly dominated by Indian firepower and control. The interplay between units during this phase played the maturation of Indian combined arms warfare. Tanks didn't advance beyond the protective envelope of artillery and infantry. Infantry didn't push forward without armour overwatch. Engineers maintained mobility under fire, ensuring what damaged tanks could be recovered and lanes kept open. This mutual dependence created resilience. Losses, while painful, didn't lead to collapse. The system absorbed shocks and continued functioning. By the end of this phase, the character of the battle had shifted decisively. Pakistani armoured formations had been blunted, their offensive potentials degraded beyond immediate recovery. Indian units, though exhausted, held firm and began to expand their control. The battlefield around the Basantar became a graveyard of metal, shattered assumptions, and Sakhagarh was no longer a contested bulge. It was a slowly collapsing front. The heroism displayed during these battles were not incidental to the outcome. It was the mechanism through which doctrine became reality. Without disciplined courage at the point of contact, no amount of planning could have held the beachhead. Without unit cohesion, individual bravery would have been wasted. Sakhagarh demonstrated that modern armoured warfare, stripped of illusion, is ultimately decided by the alignment of system and spirit. Part 7. The collapse of the Pakistani armoured counteroffensive. The collapse of the Pakistani armoured counteroffensive at Sakhagarh was not sudden, nor was it marked by a single catastrophic defeat. It was a process, slow, grinding, psychologically corrosive. By the time Pakistani command recognized that the battle had slipped beyond recovery, the conditions that might have allowed adaptations were tactically gone. What unfolded after the failure to destroy the Basantar bridgehead was not merely a tactical setback, but the disintegration of an operational concept that defined Pakistan's Western strategy since 1965. At the heart of the collapse lay the exhaustion of offensive momentum. Pakistani armour had been committed repeatedly in an attempt to restore the situation through defensive counterattack. Each attempt had been repulsed by mounting losses. Tanks destroyed or disabled could not be easily replaced or repaired under constant artillery fire. Crews who survived returned shaken, carrying with them the knowledge that courage and aggression could no longer win wars. The psychological balance of the battlefield began to tilt irreversibly. Indian forces, by contrast, grew stronger with each failed Pakistani thrust. Every repulsed counterattack validated Indian dispositions and reinforced in their defensive framework. Artillery dominance became more pronounced. Indian gunners have registered targets and refined fire plans, were able to respond more rapidly and accurately to Pakistani movements. Assembly areas that might have once served as staging grounds for fresh attacks became death traps. Pakistani units found it increasingly difficult to mask armour without attracting immediate and devastating fire. Communications broke down within Pakistan's First Corps, further accelerating the collapse. The fog, smoke, and chaos of the battlefield degraded situational awareness at every level. Orders issued from higher headquarters often arrived late or were based on outdated information. Units advancing believed that they were part of coordinated efforts, only to discover that the neighboring formations had already been destroyed or withdrawn. This fragmentation undermined the very principle concentrated armored action on which Pakistani doctrine depended. The terrain that had once promised opportunity now imposed confinement. Indian control of key approaches near Basantar forced Pakistani armor into predictable avenues of movement. These avenues were covered by Indian tanks in hull down positions, infantry, anti tank teams, pre registered artillery. Every attempt to maneuver became an exercise in attrition rather than exploitation. Tanks that survived initial engagements were often found themselves immobilized by terrain or mechanical damage, exposed to follow on fire. Leadership fatigue became evident. Pakistani commanders even faced the unenviable choice between continuing attacks that had little chance of success and conceding ground that doctrine deemed unacceptable to lose. The pressure to act decisively persisted even as conditions deteriorated. This produced a pattern of piecemeal commitment, attacks launched without mass or coordination needed to succeed, yet the costly enough to erode the remaining strength. The counter-offensive didn't die in a blaze of glory, but in a series of futile efforts that drained its lifeblood. Indian forces capitalized on the erosion with discipline. They didn't rush to exploit prematurely, aware that overextension could invite renewed counterattack. Instead, they expanded control gradually, securing flanks, improving logistics, consolidating positions. This methodical advance denied Pakistan the opportunity to regroup. The battle transitioned from violent contest to control domination, as Indian units dictated the pace and location of engagement. The symbolic impact of the collapse was profound. The Patton tanks, one emblem of Pakistani armor power, became a reminder of vulnerability. Burnt out hulks littering the battlefield told a story that no communique could conceal. Within Pakistani ranks, confidence in the inevitability of armored success eroded. Within Indian ranks, belief in the effectiveness of combined arms doctrine hardened into conviction. By the time the Pakistani command began to shift towards defensive consolidation, it was too late to restore operational balance. Indian forces had achieved their essential objectives in the Sakhagarh Bulge. They had neutralized Pakistani capacity to launch meaningful armoured offensive in the sector, and secured territory that could be held through the ceasefire. The Western Front, once a potential source of strategic leverage for Pakistan, had become a liability. The collapse of the counteroffensive didn't end the fighting immediately, but it had changed its nature. What follows were localized engagements, mopping up actions, and the steady tightening of Indian control. The decisive phase was over. The question was no longer who would dominate Sakhagarh, but how the outcome would shape the final settlement of war. The next part would be something that we must look forward to, which would be ceasefire, territorial gains, and strategic consequences.